Hey everyone, Brian Matiash here. Now, a lot of photographers I think can relate to this scenario where you're out somewhere in probably low light conditions, or for whatever reason, you don't have your shutter cable with you. You want to get an exposure with your camera, but you want to avoid touching it. And that's because any movement to the camera while you're pressing the shutter button can potentially affect your exposure. Usually you'll have a shutter cable which will mitigate that, but a lot of times photographers can forget that. Well, Sony really stepped up to the plate and released this new app called Touchless Shutter. And it's available for free in their PlayMemories App Store, which is accessible right within the camera. And this app is available on a variety of Sony Alpha cameras, so just go to their website and make sure that your model is supported. This is the Sony a7 II, and it's got a Sony FE 24-70mm lens on it. So before we dive into the app, what I'd like to do is just kind of talk about a very basic setting with these cameras. Right above the viewfinder over here, there is a proximity sensor. And what that does is it detects how close an object is to the electronic viewfinder. This is specifically made for when you put the camera to your face. It'll deactivate the rear LCD and it'll activate the electronic viewfinder. So, you put your eye towards the cup and display turns off, display turns on. Using that principle, Sony actually went ahead and built this really awesome app that will trigger an exposure. So let's take a look at it. Now, I already installed the app from the PlayMemories App Store, and there are some images that kind of walk you through that. It's pretty basic. To get to it, you're going to hit Menu, and then you're going to go over to the Application tab, which is the fourth major tab. And then the first option is Application List, so we're going to go into that. Now, I have a bunch of apps installed. The newest one here is Touchless Shutter. And you'll notice on the little thumbnail that it says beta. Now it's beta, which means that take it with a certain grain of salt. For me, my experience with it so far has been flawless. It works great. It could mean that when it goes into full production status, there might be more features. Who knows? But for now, this does something that is really unique in my opinion, and I definitely commend Sony. So to get into it, we're just going to hit the return button, and that's going to launch the app. You'll know that you're in Touchless Shutter because there will be a little icon on the top left that'll say Touchless Shutter. Both of them go away in a couple seconds. So before we actually use the app, what I want to do is walk through the settings, because that's something I think a lot of Sony photographers overlook when they download a new app onto their camera. To get to the settings, we're going to hit Menu, and this is kind of a sub-setting for the Sony cameras. It's a settings just for the app itself, not for the camera. And to begin, there are 5 tabs. We're going to start in the first one, and obviously the first option is to exit the application. We'll do that at the end. But what I want to show you is the startup guide, which is kind of funny because it's just one screen. And it says, to use Touchless Shutter, make sure Finder/Monitor or Finder/LCD setting is set to auto before launching this application. Now this is important because there actually is a setting on the camera where you can force it to only use the rear LCD or only the optical viewfinder. If you don't have it set to auto, essentially what will happen is the proximity sensor is deactivated, it won't work. So you have to set it to auto in order for the proximity sensor to work. That's absolutely critical for this application to work properly. All right, the other important setting that I think a lot of photographers overlook and should pay attention to is the actual images that get written to your SD card upon exposure. The default setting is actually JPEG fine. And if that's okay with you, cool, you don't have to do anything. However, I tend to shoot RAW plus JPEG. And the reason for that is because obviously I want my RAW files, but if I want to transfer a full res JPEG over to my phone via Wi-Fi if I'm out in the field, if I have it set to RAW only, it'll transfer over a lower res 2 megapixel JPEG. If you have it set to RAW plus JPEG, it'll transfer over the full resolution JPEG. I keep it at the image size at large for JPEG, 3:2 aspect ratio, and we'll take a look at the drive mode in a second. The next couple of settings are pretty standard. They're basically flash, focus, ISO settings for your exposure. All of these things you can, or most of these things rather, you can control while you're in camera. So you've got metering mode, white balance, your dynamic range settings, as well as your creative style, and then zoom settings, your focus magnifier, and then face detection, which I think is important for this particular application, because I think a big use for this is people who trigger the exposure and then want to run into frame. If you have autofocus turned on and face detection turned on, it'll look for faces and focus on them. So let's go ahead here, we'll hit menu to go back to the app. All right, now I'm in manual mode. So you know the modes here, manual, aperture priority, shutter priority are honored. I'm in manual mode, which means I have access to my shutter speed, my aperture, and my ISO. Now we're going to take a look at the drive mode. Now I referenced that earlier in the settings. To access the drive mode on my camera, I'm going to hit the left button on the control wheel, and you'll see that there are 3 options, and we're going to take a look at each of them. The first is your single shot. So what you first want to do is get your exposure settings dialed in and meter however you want. And I'll bring this up just to 1/5 of a second to 0 out. And again, we're going to now use the proximity sensor to trigger the exposure. So all you do is cover, exposure taken. Pretty cool. And it's pretty straightforward. Now let's go to the next drive mode. The next drive mode is a basic timer, and you have 2 options. You'll see here there's a little arrow that shows you that there are 2 options on this setting. The default is a 10-second timer, so if you trigger, the camera will wait 10 seconds for you to run into the frame or whatever and expose. The other is a 2-second delay, which I'll demo here. So I set 2 seconds, cover, we'll wait 2 seconds. I have autofocus on, and it takes the exposure. 1, 2, there. 10 seconds, we'll do the same thing, just wait 8 more seconds. Now, the third setting is kind of cool. A lot of times when you do this, where you set a timer and you run into the frame, especially when you give your camera to someone else to take the photo, oftentimes they'll just take a burst of them. And so Sony decided to build that functionality in. So what you have here is 2 options. It's a constant 10-second delay, so it's 10 seconds no matter what. But what you can do is upon triggering that 10-second delay, the camera can take either 3 exposures or 5 exposures. The same exposure settings. This is not an auto exposure bracket sequence for HDR. It's the same settings. So let's do we'll do 5 exposures at 10 seconds. I'll hit return to commit and then cover, and we'll wait the 10 seconds. So at this point now, the autofocus will hunt for focusing or for faces, and then when it counts to 10 seconds, it'll expose. So there are our 5 exposures, and you can kind of see them, they're being written here. So they're all the same, nothing's changing. And so that's the basic premise of this app, which I think is brilliant. And again, I really do commend Sony for thinking about photography needs, especially with that when they don't have certain equipment like a shutter cable, and building apps that further kind of increase the effectiveness and the usability of the Alpha ecosystem. So when you're done, the last thing you're going to do is hit menu. We're going to go back to the first tab, and we'll hit exit application. You'll get a confirmation, we'll hit exit, and now you're returned back to the camera with the basic camera settings. You'll see here, now you have all of your standard camera settings. So I hope this closer look at Touchless Shutter makes you even more excited to download it. It's for free in the PlayMemories App Store. Just go to the App Store, log in, and use it for yourself. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you next time.